Welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. Over 500 million people around the world are facing a global food crisis. Whether because of climate change, inflation, conflicts such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or governmental malfeasance, nations in Europe, Africa, North America, Latin America, South Asia, and Central Asia are faced with a growing challenge of how to feed its people. What will it take to address and resolve the global food crisis? Next. McDonald leads the Hungry for Action campaign to end the global food crisis. As an international development professional with over 15 years of experience in advocacy, policy, and communications, she has worked around the world from Ethiopia and South Africa to Rwanda, where she was a governance advisor. She most recently served as campaigns and policy director at Project Everyone, where she led efforts to advance the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Ms. McDonald led the 2015 Global Action Campaign at Save the Children. Ms. McDonald began her career with the British Labour Party as head of the research department and senior political advisor to Harriet Harman, member of the British Parliament. She is also a candidate for the British Parliament, representing the Norwich North District on the Labour Party ticket. And I'm happy to welcome here today. Alice, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on.
Let me ask you this. You have just returned from the United Nations in their General Assembly in New York City. What did you hear there that made you either optimistic or perhaps pessimistic by what they did not do?
Well, I think, going into the UN General Assembly, we are in the context of a global food crisis. And one of the things the Hungary for Action campaign was asking in advance of the UN General Assembly was really for leaders to call out what we've been saying is the elephant in the room too often and really put a focus on it. I think there were signs, and we're in the process of looking through what leaders said in their speeches at the General Assembly. But President Lula, for example, of Brazil, who will be hosting the G20 next year, put a real focus on the need to tackle hunger, which is really important to see. I mean, UN General Assemblies are, one of the only global forums where political leaders are meant to come together. Sadly, we didn't see, particularly from the Security Council, the heads of state there, and we would have liked to see that because this is an important moment to have these conversations. I think where you do see energy, and that gives me optimism, is there is a whole movement of people who care about the global food crisis and want to see action on it, whether, that's farmers on the front line across Africa. We had events with farmers from the Philippines, for example, saying this is the action we need, whether it's young people, and the food crisis is inextricably linked with the climate crisis, that there is a feeling that people, are saying we really need to see action on this before it gets even worse. So I guess a mixture, and I think all UN General Assemblies are quite like that in a way.
I want to come back to that, but let me ask you this. What exactly is the driving force behind the global food crisis? Is it is not supply, because we've proven that we do have the capacity from a technical perspective to provide food for the whole world. So is it a combination of climate change? The war in Ukraine has upended the global food chain, so to speak. Or is it just malfeasance in terms of governments? And what's the driving force behind the global food crisis?
I think, you've hit the nail on the head, really. It's a combination of all of those things. We have seen a perfect storm of high food, fertilizer, and fuel prices, which is a result of some of those compounding crises that you mentioned, whether it's, the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, the impact of climate change, and of course, the conflict in Ukraine and in other countries has really exacerbated what was already a really devastating trend of hunger. And if you look at the numbers, the State of Food Insecurity and Nutrition report that came out recently, 783 million people are hungry right now. Now, that's more than, or up to, that's the top level estimate, but that's more than the population of the US and EU combined. And although we have seen a slight fall in contrast to pre-pandemic levels, there are really clear regional disparities. And, hunger is rising in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean, for example. So I think people talk a lot about a polycrisis and all these factors coming together. The food crisis is a crisis on its own, but it is also a fact of the food crisis. And I think the other element to really highlight is poverty. Poverty is a key driver of this. And in the development space, that's got to be one of the key areas that we focus on. So I think simply when it comes down to it, it is, like you said, it is a man-made problem. There are solutions. We have enough food in the world. It's just that the system is not working for many different reasons to get that food to people who need it, and nutritious food as well. And this is an issue that affects everybody. It affects people in the UK where I live, affects people in the US where we were last week, and it affects people all around the world just in different ways and with different impacts.
Now, speaking about the UN and the General Assembly, one of the goals that they have, what they call the SDGs, is Sustainable Development Goals. But Gutierrez had said that a lot of those goals, quite frankly, are off track. A lot of them, in fact, have gone backwards. President Biden, when he was there at the United Nations, said one sentence about global hunger. So if the SDGs are behind the timeline, how do you expect them to address this food crisis, which, given what's going on in the world, is probably only going to get worse before
Mm.
it actually gets better?
And it was a really important moment for the Sustainable Development Goals. And as you said in your introduction, I spent the last 7 years from 2015 when they were agreed, working on the kind of advocacy and communications around them. And Project Everyone, the organization I used to work for, was really focused on this half-time campaign because we're at the halfway point for the goals this year. And at half time in a match, that's when you have to rally your efforts together and get behind. If you're a team, you want to say, okay, this is where we can turn it around. This is where we can start to win. So I think this is a really important moment. And, hunger and poverty are two of the goals where we're actually going backwards, and they really need an effort. And we do have the solutions. We know what needs to happen. The UN has been leading the food systems summit and transformation track, which is a really important process that looks at all these interlinking issues. But what we need to look at is what are the real tangible actions that we need to happen. Unsurprisingly, money and finance is a huge topic of conversation. We know that national budgets are constrained for all sorts of reasons, and that's why, and I'm definitely not an expert on the financial reform piece, but there is a whole movement championed by people like Mia Mottley, the president of Barbados, on the Bridgetown agenda, which is actually looking at how do we reform the financial system so that we free up the funds to tackle some of these big challenges like hunger. There's some estimates that have been done of what is the cost of tackling hunger in key countries, and it's about an additional $10 billion annually from now until 2030 to achieve food systems transformation in Ethiopia, Malawi, and Nigeria. So that is actually not, it sounds like a big sum of money, but it is totally feasible to do that. But what we need is that political will, and there are some good signs and momentum building around this whole financing agenda. So I think when it comes to the goals, it's really important to have a goal. We've got to work towards it. We can't give up. We've got to redouble our efforts to achieve that goal of zero hunger by 2030.
Now, in terms of countries wanting to take a role in solving this crisis, but one of the issues, for example, Gutierrez did want to move the Black Sea grain agreement along, which has not happened thus far. And that's a big part of the issue right now in
Yeah.
terms of a current issue. So if you have nations like Russia, you have nations like North Korea, and you also have nations like China who are using food, quite frankly, as a weapon, the weaponization of hunger. How do you get at that? And how do countries such as United Kingdom, United States, the Western nations, for the most
Mm.
part, begin to attack that aspect of the crisis?
I mean, yeah, that's a very, very big question. And, I think the role of the UN, and the UN helped to broker that deal before that sadly collapsed just before the UN General Assembly. And I think the UN has a key role to play around this in terms of the diplomacy and trying to get the affected countries around a table to find solutions. I think it is part of calling out, what is causing this, and the lack of, well, not the lack of the, I'm not going to get into the whole Russia Ukraine war here, but that has been caused by Russia, and they're the ones who can end it. I think when you look at some of the interesting things that were coming out of UNGA, and obviously President Zelensky was there has been some focus around a kind of a grain hub initiative with certain countries in Africa. So looking at how you can still get those exports out of Ukraine to places like Kenya. So I think we will expect to see more detail on that in the next few weeks, but ultimately we've got to get a resolution to conflict. And there are other countries, a lot of the countries most affected by hunger are conflict affected states, and that is a whole area that we've got to have a lot more effort on. And again, it points to reform of some of the institutions that we have, like the UN Security Council, for example. I think it's very positive that the African Union will be joining the G20 as a member, and I do think the Brazilian G20 next year, the G7 in Italy, are opportunities. And actually in 2008-9, when we had the last major global food crisis, it was at the Italian G8 then when the Aquila initiative was agreed, and there were some major breakthroughs made on global cooperation to tackle this crisis. And I think as the Hungry for Action campaign, that's what we've been saying. Ahead of UNGA, we were saying, acknowledge this elephant in the room. The first step to solving a problem is accepting there is one in the first place. And we need to see that kind of joined up global plan that looks at how do you save lives now? How do you build resilience so you prevent future food crises as well? So it's not easy, but I think with enough political will, you can get to some tangible solutions to make progress.
I want to ask you about why this issue is not more of a political issue for people on the ground. Okay, you can talk about it within the auspices of the United Nations, whether it's the G77 or the G20 or whomever, but it's not a political issue that people are talking about around the world in most Western nations. For example, I remember decades ago the issue of Biafra, and hunger of that was a major issue, and it was a political issue. How do you make this a political issue for people on the ground and make them understand the severity of the crisis?
I think, I do think people feel this is a political issue, but it plays out in different ways. And maybe people don't think about it as a global food crisis, but certainly, in the UK, we've seen a much increased use of food banks, for example, in the US as well. So, as I said before, poverty, inequality is exacerbating access to good, nutritious food. So I think you have to, and this is part of the challenge of being a campaigner, is how do you have really clear messages about how this is affecting people globally, creating that sense of solidarity around it. And we saw that during the COVID pandemic, right? When people we were all affected by the COVID pandemic, again in different ways, but there was a real sense of people coming together in communities to tackle these big challenges. And I think it's about bringing home the urgent need for action, but also this long term, that actually is in all of our interests to tackle this food crisis, because it's only going to get worse. And as I said, I think linking it to the climate crisis, both as a driver of the climate crisis, but a consequence, is an important kind of message to bring across. But I think, when it comes to campaigning, it's, having really clear messages that cut through to people, that show why this matters and what the solutions are. We were talking today about, do you inspire action by kind of painting this doom and gloom scenario, or actually is it through more kind of showing what impact achieves and inspiring people through hope? So I definitely don't have all the answers on that. Campaigning is hard, but I think there are lots of very smart people in this space who are really focused on how do we get that message across. And when I look where I am, the amazing community organizations on the front line, people who are setting up food banks, and this is in all countries, who are setting up these initiatives. Also, there's a key part of how do we support that work as well.
Your campaign, you do have an agenda. You do have items that you want to see resolved. What's the actual agenda for you all in terms of what you are demanding, not only from the UN, but from other countries as well? Because, as you said, this is a global issue.
Mhm.
And whether it's folks like yourself or people like Cindy McCain and the work that she's doing right now in the United States, um, what are you asking governments to do specifically right now?
So we've got the Hunger for Action campaign has kind of, three main messages. We need to save lives now, build resilience and secure the future. And if I highlighted a few of the asks, and if you go to our website, you can see it's about 10 asks. One is providing the humanitarian assistance we need right now. So you mentioned World Food Programme. They don't have the funding they need to reach the people who really need support. So we are asking donor countries to step up in that regard. We have to look at how we can scale up cash assistance. That makes a real difference in terms of, direct funding to people and social protection systems. Where we have to look at nutrition interventions. There are things like there's a big pilot right now, not a pilot in Kenya, free school meals. Like those interventions make a real difference. So it's asking national governments to support those kind of programs. And then there is some really kind of key asks around funding. So we need to see funding for climate adaptation doubled. We need to see investment in small scale farmers and food producers. That's not enough. And then there's this whole ask around cancellation of debt for poor countries. And if you look in Africa, some of the countries who are experiencing the highest levels of food insecurity also have the highest levels of debt. And if you're spending your money servicing debt instead of spending it on the actions that will help get food to your people, that can't be the right way round. And one of the things we've been calling for within these finance discussions is a debt cancellation clause when countries are backsliding on food and malnutrition. And I think it was in June at the Macron, the kind of Paris French hosted finance summit, that there was agreement on debt cancellation for Zambia, for example. So this can be done, but again, it really comes back to that political will. But our number one ask is really make this a priority. If you're a government leader or any political leader in business as well, we've all got a role to play in this. What can you do to help tackle this global food crisis?
There's a lot of talk, whether it's global food crisis or nuclear proliferation, about the issue of intersectionality. And it sounds like what you're saying, we have to look at this from a myriad of ways. It's not simply getting food to people, but for example, debt relief is important. And you were just talking about the Bridgetown Initiative from Barbados. And are you going to be on the front lines for that as well? Because you said if I have to pay interest on the debt, I can't really provide food for people. So, how do you see yourself, your organization, partnering with other folks who may be in other areas other than food security, but you do understand intersectionality of issues that causes food insecurity? So, how are you beginning to build alliances with other organizations?
Well, the Hungry for Action is an alliance of organisations. It brings together a variety of organisations from, global organisations like World Vision and Save the Children, but also organisations like the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, based across Africa. So it is about bringing different groups together to advocate on some key issues. And this issue of kind of financial reform and debt is absolutely one that we're engaging with as a campaign, because I think one of the main, sometimes that debate can get very technical, that conversation get very technical in terms of, special drawing rights, SDRs, all these acronyms. But actually, if you bring it back to why are we trying to free up these funds, it is to tackle some of the biggest challenges we face. And hunger is one of those. It helps, to your point before, to really get that message to across with the public, but then the pressure on politicians to act. So we've worked with people like President Banda, the former president of Malawi, to make this argument, to really communicate why it is important. And, for me, it's also about how do we support and how do we amplify the voices of people in African countries who really are horrendously affected by that, farmers' voices, to kind of show why this really matters. So I think it is about all of us coming together. And sometimes the NGO civil society space, we can counteract each other by saying too many things at the same time. So there are moments where we all have to be saying, like, this is absolutely what we need, reform of these financial institutions, because that is going to help all of the different areas. And just on your point on interconnectedness, of course, that is the beauty of the sustainable development goals. It's that wheel and that circle, because you can't tackle one of those issues without tackling some of the others. And we haven't touched on gender here, but women are disproportionately affected by this. They are primarily the producers of food, and there is a whole gendered aspect to the global food crisis that I hope also will be putting more of a spotlight on in the next kind of few months and year.
I think you would agree that part of the issue right now is as many nations are experiencing a lurch towards the right and isolationism. Now,
Mm.
I mean, if you talk about Brazil, President Lula has begun to reverse that from his predecessor. The United States could be heading towards isolationism depending upon what happens in 2024. But that is a big part of it. And what goes with that is the notion of self interest of a nation. So, how do you begin to let governments know that this is in your self interest to deal with the global food crisis? Because you do see right now, it's not in our backyard. If you're heading towards the right, it's not in our backyard, so there's no need for us to worry about it. So the question is, how do you get governments to really think that this is in their self-interest? Beyond, I mean, there's always an humanitarian
Mm.
aspect and component to every nation, but the overreaching principle for politics is self-interest. So how do you deal with that?
I think I'm fundamentally optimistic about people, and I think people do care about issues in other countries, and we have to show politicians that there are, lots of people in lots of countries around the world who do care about this and don't want to see this retreat into isolationism. I would argue that, the global food crisis is already affecting people in, the UK, the US. We have to show how it's having an impact on food prices and also volatility. That the planning, like we don't know what's going to necessarily happen in the next kind of by 2030. So I think we have to make the case that this is in all our interests, and actually it can be solved. And I think the beauty, and I'm just coming back to that financial reform conversation, it's not actually new money, it's freeing up money that is already there. Because I know it's difficult to say to people, spend money on tackling this overseas, and people see it as that, but actually there's money there that exists that can be freed up to tackle this. And again, that's also part of the value of campaigns like Hungry for Action, is kind of engaging the public around these issues and putting more pressure on their leaders to take action on it. So yeah, again, it's not an easy one to do, but I think we have to kind of have hope and look outwards, not inwards.
And that's kind of what I wanted to really press upon is because I do remember the last time we had the a real deep conversation about debt forgiveness of developing nations. And it became a grassroots movement that eventually led to a lot of debt relief for
Yeah.
a lot of countries. And I guess it just raised the question that this requires the same type of grassroots commitment and action such as what your organization is doing. And but it was also at a time I think when perhaps nations or people on the ground saw their self-interest as beyond their borders. And I'm just wondering now if you're finding that people, even though you have faith in the humanitarianism of people, but still, there are a lot of folks who, quite frankly, don't want to do anything that's beyond their borders.
Mm.
And a lot of those folks seem to be coming to power in various nations. I mean, even in Turkey with Erdogan, and inflation is through the roof there. You see a lot right now with Poland and how, because of the election, they're beginning to throw Ukraine under the bus. And so a lot of these things are beginning to happen. Does that pose a challenge for the work that you're trying to do?
I mean, I think for any campaign, it's always operating within a political context. So you always have to take into account what is the political reality. As you mentioned, next year is going to be a big one for elections. We're likely to have one we will have one in the UK, the US, I think India as well. So I think in some ways that can be an opportunity for campaigns because you've got a way to kind of try and push these issues up the agenda. But it isn't easy. And of course, we haven't really touched on the role of kind of media and social media and the landscape in terms of campaigning has totally changed from when we had the whole kind of Jubilee debt movement. And again, that poses challenges, but opportunities as well. So I think, yeah, with any campaign, you have to work within the political context that you are in. And I do think food is something universal that people understand, and being able to access food at an affordable price and good food, I think, is something that hopefully people can relate to, which again, I think opens up some opportunities for campaigning. But yeah, there's no doubt that there is a rise of populism, and we've got to take that into account when we're campaigning on these issues.
Next year is a huge UN meeting because it will encompass some reorganization in terms of what they call the Maastricht principles. What do you want to see happen in 2024 at the United Nations General Assembly in
Well,
2024?
I think actually we've kind of I think there are a lot of opportunities in 2024, and actually it will be kind of the 40-year anniversary of the Ethiopian famine, where people said, never again. Yet here we are again with many people
Yes.
going hungry. So what we're hoping to do next year is at all opportunities to kind of really put this high on the agenda. As I said, I think with moments like the G20, that can be an opportunity to kind of try and get some action around this. I think this whole financing agenda has got to get to some conclusions next year before a US election, which again will pose some challenges around that. I think at the UN, I mean, I would love to see, like this year, every leader going there and saying tackling the food crisis is a priority, and we've done X and Y in the last few years to help advance that conversation. We did call for an emergency meeting this year at UNGA. I mean, obviously we can't call for an emergency meeting a year in advance, but I hope there would be a really focused spotlight on this issue and what needs to happen at the UN General Assembly next year. And I hope all the leaders show up at head of state level, so that you can have these conversations that need to be had and inspire action around it.
Do you think Gutierrez has really taken this issue seriously? I know he supports these sustainable development goals. I mean, that's a given. But he has been criticized in terms of either his silence about humanitarian needs. He has been criticized for that. So, do you think he has shown enough attention to the issue to gain traction so that the issue can be resolved, or at least mitigated to the point where we don't have a crisis in terms of food?
I think and I think when he opened the SDG summit this year, actually, and I'm not going to get it exactly right because I don't have it in front of me, but hunger is an indictment of humanity. Like he really highlighted that as a key issue that is a kind of a yardstick of how we are how we are living as human beings in relation to each other. So I do think he's put a real spotlight on it, and I do think things like brokering the Black Sea grain deal before was really important. Of course, there's always more that we want all political leaders to do, but I do think he has given a high priority to this issue, and things like the UN Food Systems Summit have kind of given this a whole track within the UN system that I think, particularly at national level, has helped to drive action. COP28 will be a really big moment coming up next, and there is lots of movement around food at that meeting, and it is really crucial that we link up these conversations around climate, as you said at the beginning. And as I said, the climate crisis is one of the key reasons that we have the food crisis. So we absolutely need to look at and hope that COP relates in really some tangible actions around the food crisis.
Looking at the issue of climate change, as you know, in many countries, climate is a controversial issue, even though the vast majority of scientists acknowledge climate change and that we have to do something about that. But there is still that political aspect of it. But another question I have for you is between now and next year, is your organization going to be coming together with other organizations to maybe plan something that's large in effect, that presents a an agenda to the UN that says you must take this seriously, and do that perhaps in partnership with maybe not necessarily the G20 all the time, but what is called the G77.
Yeah.
But the G77 represents 80% of the world's population. So is there going to be some movement to coalesce with other organizations, as you now do, but make it broader, but also to acquiesce an alliance with the G77?
So the Hungry for Action campaign is open to anyone to kind of join organizations. We hope that more organizations will. We actually had our own kind of emergency meeting at UNGA with civil society to really look at how can we work more effectively together, what are the key areas to focus on and the opportunities next year. I think we've got this set of demands on our website that we are trying to raise at all moments, and obviously they will slightly be refined when we're looking at specific aspects within them. But I think it's a very good point about the G77 and how we engage with those. So it's definitely something that I hope we can pursue in the year ahead. And alliances and campaigns like the Hungry for Action campaign are built by the people who want to be engaged within it. So anyone listening who wants to get involved, do find my contacts on the website and get in touch, because for me that's what campaigning is about. It comes from the energy of people and the ideas and implementing things that can ultimately make a difference.
Pick up on that to go further with that. What is your strategy, let's say, for the media? Because the media is easily distracted, and whatever
Yeah.
the shiny object is at the time is what they go after. How are you going to engage the media, which can also help make this a more politically viable issue?
I mean, I hope I think you're right. It's hard to get some media focus around this. I think it's really important that we have different voices talking about these issues. When we launched the call to action before the UN General Assembly, we had 30 kind of leaders, and they range from leaders of NGOs to actually musicians. We had a prominent rapper from Kenya engaged in that. We had chefs who are quite a powerful voice in this, and then we've had celebrities and kind of famous activists like Sabrina Elba and Bob Geldof coming on board as well. So sometimes it's about the different voices that you've got talking about the same issue. It's sharing interesting facts and figures and human interest stories that really bring this to life to show what the impact is. But I think also it's asking media to step up and cover it. I'm sure you'll remember when we talked about the climate crisis, there's been much bigger attention on that as it comes over the last few years, and different outlets focusing on that more. So I think it's also a choice of media to concentrate on things, but the job of campaigners is to create interesting stories for them to cover and highlight interesting things that are happening.
You've been in this field for a long time, and you've been in politics, working within the British Parliament. 5 years from now, or maybe a decade from now, where do you think we will be as it pertains to the global food crisis?
I think that's a very good question. I wish I had a crystal ball. And actually, we were just looking at a quote from the president of the African Development Bank, Adesina, earlier, who said, as far as I'm concerned, we shouldn't be talking about food security in Africa more than 5 years from now, because we have the technology and the financing to do it. So I would hope we manage to unlock these obstacles. I'd hope the deadline of the Sustainable Development Goals is an impetus for action. I would love to see, I think if you look back, 2009 was the last time we had a really major food crisis like this. But as I said, it's continued to be an issue. We don't want to have another food crisis in this kind of same timeline. And if we put the right measures in place, we can avoid that happening. And I think we have to avoid this lurching from one crisis to another. And you only get action when it's really at crisis point. We have to have that ongoing focus on the solutions that are needed. So I hope that in 5 years' time, we're not talking about the food crisis, but we're talking about a food system that's been transformed so it works for people and for planet.
My guest today has been Alice McDonald, who leads the Hungry for Action campaign to end the global food crisis. And Alice, I want to thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for listening. And join us again next week as we have another issue of global importance and interest here on the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective.
The Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective, is produced by Casa Margo Communications Group.